Resident Evil 4. I'm just going to get to it because you know that Resident Evil 4 is regarded as one of the greatest games of all time, and for good reason. It has done so much not just regarding the future of the RE franchise, for better and for worse, but has left a lasting impact on the gaming industry as a whole. If you look at any other horror game that came out in the years after 2005, 7 times out of 10 that game drew some form of inspiration from Resident Evil 4. I made that statistic up, but it's true to an extent. Dead Space in terms of horror, and even non-horror games too, like Naughty Dog games and even the Gears of War series. The point is that Capcom made a game that people still look back to for inspiration, and if you ask a person what their favorite horror game is, 6 times out of 10, they will answer with Resident Evil 4. Again, I made that statistic up, but the point is, a lot of people love this game. Although RE4 is not my favorite Resident Evil game, I know that this game is amazing, so with the Resident Evil 4 Remake dropping later this month, I wanted to honor this game and make a true Storm experience about it, talking about its best parts and some of its not so good parts. So if you're wondering what I think about RE4, well, I already said that know that it is an amazing game, so I'll leave it with that. Now, let's delve into the turning point of the survival horror and look back at
Resident Evil 4.
Once you boot up the game and start your new game, you get a PowerPoint introduction narrated by your TED Talk host for today, Leon Scott Kennedy, who talks about his perception of the events that happened prior in RE2 and the aftermath as to what had happened. How Umbrella went bankrupt, which I'm not going to lie is pretty funny to think that this massive pharmaceutical company just lost all of its power because their stock value dropped. I know it's just odd that that's how Umbrella fell from grace, but moving on, fade to black, and in comes this masterpiece of a song.
I received special training via a secret organization working under the direct control of the president.
This whole cutscene sets the mood and tone for the rest of the game. For one, we get to see the serious story that the game wants to set up. Leon telling us about his mission and objective to save the president's daughter, a certain Ashley Graham, who we'll be talking about later. The game also creates the unnerving tone through its cutscene direction by showing shots of the characters being watched as they enter the village, with one angle of the cop looking around him whilst, yes, doing this. However, on the complete contrary of the serious story and scary vibes, the game also goes ahead and sets up the goofy nature of the characters. Leon telling the cops that his mission is to search for the president's daughter, to which they respond with by saying,
What? All by yourself?
To which we are then given the first piece of gold from the gold mine, which is Leon's quotes throughout this game.
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire. But then again, maybe you did.
Comedy gold, am I right? The first cutscene does a great job setting the tone of what's next to come, but we haven't gotten to the actual gameplay part of the introduction yet. As the car pulls up to the village, Leon hops out, gets a call from Hunnigan, who acts as your support and guide throughout the game. She doesn't appear too many times, but when she does, the interactions are short and brief. And once this call is over, we are greeted with this. The ominous woods. Flock of crows, is it flock? Herd? Never mind. The dying nature. This village entrance is such a good mood setter. You don't know what's going on, where the people are, and as you head up to the path to the first house that you see at the end of the clearing, the leaves crackle underneath the weight of your every step. This house is nothing special, but there appears to be no sign of life there, at all. Entering the house, we are once again greeted with just a really strange and funny interaction. There is a villager here, and Leon asks him, in English, a villager who probably doesn't know any English at all, whether he has seen this girl. The villager also turns around the wrong way. I mean, there is no wrong way to turn around, but it's just off-putting, really contributing to the mysterious atmosphere. And he then proceeds to take an axe and attempts to hit Leon, and then the first combat encounter of the game plays, and man, do I love this encounter theme when you enter into combat. It's so tense, but yes, this is the first half of the introduction, and man is it one start, and it only gets better. In a nutshell, we are then tasked with escaping this house through the second floor, jump out the window, take out more Ganados, and keep moving towards the village center, rescue a dog for later because Doggo needs help. Sure, this is a very intense start to the game, but it's important and consistent in setting the action gameplay, sprinkled in with the horror here and there. However, I can see the argument that some would say, oh, this is just a linear corridor game, but that is not the case. RE4, although far more linear compared to the 3 previous games in the series, does have exploration and deviations later on in the game, and at the start, it's the objective of finding Ashley and the village that pushes us forward, and our own curiosity that makes us wonder as to what went wrong with the village and what makes them so hostile. As you head closer to the village, we get to see more of these deranged Ganados, and then we get the perfect opportunity to scope out the village, and what we see isn't exactly what we had hoped for. In the center of the village, the Ganados have nailed one of the police officers from earlier to a plank and have set him afire. It's a horrific situation, taking away the only sane people on your team, leaving you alone with the mission of rescuing Ashley. And so you move your way upwards into the village, and then we have one of the coolest sequences in all of gaming. If you've only heard about Resident Evil 4, you've heard about the village intro sequence. The sequence when all the villagers in the area swarm you, and you should try to take out as many as you can, realize that they don't stop coming, and you keep on running. This section is just perfect. Resources scattered around, enough for you to be alive, but not enough to guarantee your survival. It's also important to note that the villagers are smart as well, working together, coordinating to some extent, with some trying to throw weapons at you from a range, whilst others try to get up close and personal. Oh, and the Spanish lines that they mumble out you saying, "There he is," or "Kill him," es simplemente perfecto. This also is the area where we introduced one of the scariest enemies in the game, Dr. Salvador, or Chainsaw Man. Upon entering a house and barricading the door, a cutscene will play of the Chainsaw Man revving up his, chainsaw and coming towards the house, and as you escape to the second floor, the glowing shotgun rests there in its glass case, waiting for you to take it. What makes this whole situation even more tense is the fact that the only way to get out of this situation is to go through the second floor window, which opens up the area over the rooftops where more Ganados are waiting to take you out. It really shows how nowhere is safe, and you've got to be able to survive in any given situation the game deals you. Now, the only way to survive is either by killing a certain amount of Ganados or waiting 7 minutes, and once you do complete this, one of gaming's most iconic cutscenes plays.
Lord Sattler.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I mean, bingo? Really? Just top tier levels of comedy. And seeing the complete bird's eye view of the village is mesmerizing and haunting, letting you know that this is only the beginning and the game is going to get a lot more hectic. In my personal opinion, the opening hour of Resident Evil 4 is up there as one of the best introductions or runs even in a game ever, on par with the run from Firelink all the way to Anor Londo and Dark Souls, Breath of the Wild's tutorial, the intro to The Last of Us and Midgar of Final Fantasy VII. It really is perfect in all aspects and is echoed throughout the game, and is a prime reason as to why so many people find the village area to be the best area of the game, and I think this is a nice moment to segue into the next section of this video, the village. Like I just said, the rest of the village area keeps up the pacing of the introduction and runs with it. The village, located in the rural area of Spain called Val de Lobos, Valley of the Wolves. I was at first planning to make this video like a retelling of how the game progresses, but that would make this video already longer than it needs to be, so instead I'll be just giving a description of the village, pros and cons, and my personal input. Of course, we have the first villager's house and the village center that I talked about in the introduction, but there is so much more to this village that the village center quickly becomes a memory of the past. You have the place where you first meet Luis, escaping the mines where you first meet the merchant, or the lake with the lago, the church and graveyard where we first find Ashley. Any RE4 fans know these areas by heart, and for good reason, because these areas are all memorable moments and encounters, and share the consistent vibe of horror and uneasiness. It's safe to say that the village will leave a mark on your playthrough through the game. My favorite part of the village are the encounters you have with the enemies here. Of course, the village survival sequence is super memorable, but there are many more. There's a cabin survival part where you and Luis, everyone's favorite smooth-talking cop, try to fend off the seemingly endless waves of zombies that break down the windows and barriers. Personally, I believe that this sequence alone was what inspired Call of Duty Zombies mode, but hey, moving on. Going up to the graveyard in front of the church for the first time was also up there for me as one of my highlights of the village. Not being able to see all the enemies you go up against as it lies on a hill, with enemies suddenly coming out from behind you, it's a memorable close quarters scenario that'll keep you on your A game. What adds to these encounters is just simply the varied level design, like the graveyard having open areas for you to walk around and take out the Ganados one by one, or the cliffside with small platforms encouraging you to take out the Ganados from afar. The game constantly changes the way it wants to present its enemies, encouraging you yourself to constantly adapt to the ever-changing environment so that it doesn't feel too sudden and changes naturally. In short, this village just has plain good, well, not just good, amazing level design. Of course, after lots of normal enemy encounters, there's also got to be a mini-boss or boss encounters after a certain amount of time. The village and the later areas of the game have stellar big-time encounters. Take the smaller scale ones first, like the Bella Sisters or El Gigante. These enemies are menacing, coming at you with their 2 chainsaws that can insta-kill you, or El Gigante who can make quick work of you and free you around like a fiddle. And if you are a good Samaritan and help the dog from a trap in the introduction, he comes back to help you with your first fight against El Gigante. If you didn't save the dog, why? Why didn't you? There is no excuses. But anyways, the big boss fights. The village has 2 of them, Del Lago and Chief Mendez. Del Lago's fight is a gimmick fight where you're being dragged around on a boat by this big, mutated fish thing, and your only form of attacking it is by throwing an endless amount of harpoons at it until it dies, sprinkled in with some occasional swimming back to the boat sections after it knocks you off in the form of quick time events. Even if this fight sounds super boring and mundane, it's actually a lot of fun. It might not be everyone's favorite boss fight, but it sure does set a bar for the spectacle and challenge that the future bosses will pose to you. The next fight with Chief Mendez is probably one of the best ones. Mendez is one of the big guys that you'll have seen sometimes throughout your journey thus far. He's tall and is really just menacing. His fight takes place in a barn that's on fire with 2 floors, and Mendez starts mutating into this centipede spine thing on 2 legs, and you have to keep switching between the floors to keep on dealing damage to him and avoid his Mr. Fantastic-like attacks. Just honestly a super fun and good fight. And like any good opening area should do, they should introduce you to the other characters and gameplay mechanics that you'll be seeing later on in the game, like the characters who will help you, Ashley and Luis, to the main villain, Lord Saddler. Upon meeting Ashley in the church, she joins your party and she instantly makes it clear that she is helpless and in dire need of protection, or Luis, who just seems to be just as good at throwing one-liners as Leon is when you're both tied up together, which leads to some pretty funny and iconic banter between this trio. Saddler, on the other hand, is quite mysterious. We hear his name first mentioned after the village attack sequence when the church bell rings, which I wonder who would do such a thing, and some of the villagers mumbled his name, and when we meet him later on in the village, you can tell that he is menacing. He's got his cult leader vibe going and monologues about the usual world domination stuff. Another thing, on the gameplay side of things, the village makes it clear that you won't be meeting the same enemies throughout the game over and over again, but rather they will evolve with you as you progress. Early on, once you take out a Ganado, they will fall flat and flatline, but later on, after many encounters and having done the same procedure, the corpse of a seemingly dead Ganado springs to life, with a strange parasite growing out of its head. It's a gruesome sight to behold, but also a pretty good scare too, catching you off guard on your first time playing. Overall, the village is an iconic area in gaming for so many good reasons, ranging from its atmosphere to the way it's of introducing you to the gameplay of RE4. And speaking of gameplay, now I think is a good time to dive into the gameplay of Resident Evil 4. To say that the gameplay mechanics and the gameplay loop itself of RE4 are masterful would be an understatement. It might not be perfect, as I do have some issues in regards to how it fits into the genre of survival horror. It finds its line between excellent and perfect. First up, gameplay and its mechanics. If you are a relatively modern gamer, having started playing video games towards the end of the 2000 decades, you will, myself included, encounter a weird control scheme that may take some getting used to. Unlike most modern third-person shooters where you can freely move the camera around as you move and strafe, you cannot do that in RE4. To look around, you have to come to a standstill and then move the camera left or right to go in said direction. You can run straight and slightly move left and right, but in order to do sharper turns, you are required to stop and then turn. Another issue you'll encounter is that you are unable to shoot whilst moving, like turning left or right. You also have to come to a stop, where you can then pull out your weapon and aim and reload. And again, you can only aim at what is in front of you, not being able to aim to the sharper sides of left or right, which requires you to lower your weapon, change direction, and then pull it out again. This might seem like a really poor control scheme, but do keep one thing in mind, is that I said that it can take some getting used to, because in the end, the control scheme takes maybe an hour or so for you to get used to, and then after that, it's smooth sailing. Although the controls may feel clunky at the start, I think it adds to the progression of the player and the survival horror feeling that it wants to go for. When you first start playing, you feel confused and maybe a bit lost, still trying to figure out your bearings, and as you get swarmed pretty early on, not knowing how the controls fully work adds to this tension and fear that they have created. Not many games make the controls feel like they are a part of the game, like Shadow of the Colossus for instance. However, once you do nail the controls, Leon reflects this with the rest of his arsenal of his moves. RE4's gameplay is a bit strange, as on your first playthrough, the gameplay reflects both the player and Leon's progression in the world, and this same feeling cannot be replicated. However, what helps with this is that the game just feels so good to play. First, the gunplay is just on point. Aiming and shooting feels so good, and add the iconic red laser dot sight to each weapon, and you got yourself an overall satisfying combat system. The wide range of weapons from the Red 9 to the Striker shotgun to the TMP to the secret weapons like the Chicago typewriter. All these weapons play so differently from one another that you can do weapon-only runs on each subsequent playthrough, with each giving you a completely new gameplay experience. All this, and I haven't even talked about the knife or the martial arts that Leon can pull off. First, the knife. It's a simple knife mapped to a button, it's got unlimited uses, is fairly strong too, and is useful to check if enemies are dead and breaking other objects around the world to find items and such. It's a simple knife, nothing more, nothing less. Now for the martial arts. Using your weapons you can pull off headshots or shooting enemies at other vulnerable points to stagger them. Staggered enemies open up a short time frame for Leon to go up to the enemy, and depending on the stagger, can either do a full-on roundhouse kick to knock back any enemy closely in front of Leon, or a suplex grab. Not only are these two moves useful moves to take out the many enemies, it's downright hilarious seeing a super agent of the state take out zombies with a wrestling move. It's just funny. But these moves can't just be used over and over again because the enemies are always constantly changing and adapting to Leon. The enemy variety in RE4 has such a big range from the normal Ganados, regenerators, and minigun wielders. I'll get to the latter one later on in the video, but the point is, no two encounters will be the same. Coupled along with the weapons you have at your disposal, combined with the enemy variety, you've always got to adapt. And adapt, that's what the game does. RE4 has something that not many other games have: adaptive difficulty. I know it's been talked about a lot in the past, and I'm far from the first person to say it, but it needs to be mentioned. At the start of the game, you are given your difficulty choices, but that doesn't mean the game is set to one difficulty throughout the whole game. The game watches you closely with every death and takes notes. When it sees that it becomes too easy for you, the game gradually increases the difficulty so that you are becoming challenged. If you are struggling a lot, the game will lower the difficulty for you. The game does all this so that the experience reigns supreme, and you don't have to get frustrated for the game being too difficult or the game being a cakewalk, making sure that you're always in the gaming difficulty sweet spot. One area that is bound to create some talking points is Ashley. Ashley is the president's daughter and is the main objective of the mission, as you have to rescue her and escape the village. A lot of people aren't the biggest fan of Ashley because whenever she joins your party, the game becomes an escort mission. You have to guide her around the village, protect her from incoming attacks, shoot enemies once they do kidnap her before they send her into the void. Where do they actually take her? Does anyone know? Are they okay in there? And every time Ashley does get taken, you will be hearing a lot of this. A lot of players get frustrated at the constant shouting, and it gets annoying for some. For me personally, not at all, because I always kept her safe, and to be blunt, I think having Ashley function as an escort mission is brilliant design choice. Like I said earlier with the controls adding to the gameplay feel, so too does Ashley. She makes you take in more of your surroundings and play more cautiously. Moreover, I think I heard this from the completionist review of RE4, don't quote me on that, but if you let Ashley get caught, it's not because the game is being unfair, it's because you let her get caught. You failed a part of the mission, you did not keep her safe, and still going on this train of thought, Ashley is probably the best escort mission companion that one can have, because she is always close to you in order to keep herself safe from the hordes of enemies. You can order Ashley to stay behind in some areas, and even dump her in a dumpster if you want to avoid having her get caught or deal with her at all. I think it's a perfectly balanced mechanic that works well in, once again, adding to the atmosphere that the game has established. There is also a section where you get to play as Ashley, or not get to, have to play as Ashley, and this section reminds me a lot of the classic survival horror feel. You have no weapon, your only ways to engage with the enemies is to either throw some finite resources at them, hide, or run away. Ashley's sections are up there as one of the most tense segments of the game, really encapsulating the feeling of fear. However, although these sections were some of the most scary, there's a pretty big gap between this feeling and the average scary feeling when playing as Leon. I don't see an issue in this, but RE4 is a departure from the classic survival horror formula. Resources aren't as limited as they were in previous titles, inventory management is practically non-existent with the briefcase system, and the merchant always lets you buy more resources and upgrades as the game progresses. The game doesn't have the traditional elements that make it feel as scary to play as the previous Resident Evil titles. Take the looping level design, an aspect that is ever present in the first 3 Resident Evil installments, where you get new keys that unlock earlier locations you couldn't access earlier, which then gives you new items and you've got the loop going, slowly opening the map the further you dive into the game. Although this sounds similar to Metroidvanias, you don't get any stat buffs or physique altering stuff, meaning that you are on the same physical level as you were to start. RE4 also does away with this with the yellow herb, allowing you to permanently increase your health. Even if I don't see an issue with making RE4 more action focused compared to the earlier entries, I can see why some fans didn't like this change, and that's something we'll be looking at later on in the video. Overall, RE4's gameplay and gameplay loop work in tandem to create a super memorable experience of action horror as it slowly progresses with you. Now, let's move out of the village and into the next main area of the game, the castle. For the amount of people that have the village as their favorite area in RE4, just as many love the castle section of RE4. The castle has so many good and memorable moments that it's very clear to see why it's beloved. Where the village creates an amazing introduction and unsettling atmosphere, the castle keeps this momentum going with great cutscenes and going in for the more horror-focused tone. Let's talk about the tone first. For me, I find the castle to be an overall scarier and more consistent section compared to the village and the final area of the game, but it doesn't have the scariest moments in the game because that belongs to the last area of the game, which we'll be talking about later again. However, there are lots of moments in the castle that are there to put you on edge on a more frequent basis compared to the other areas. The darker, dead-looking buildings don't make you feel at home and have you wondering what could be around the next corner. And to follow up with this scary vibe, we've got some of the scariest enemies in the game. We've got the castle Ganados, stronger versions of the village Ganados that are dripped out with religious clothing. You can even hear them reciting verses to themselves at times, which adds to the creepy feeling. Or the Garrador enemies that are blind and only react to sounds, making them very unpredictable at times. Apart from the bosses, the 3 most memorable combat encounters for me had to be the night room, the courtyard, and you already know it if you played it, the water room. First, the night room. You enter this seemingly empty room until suddenly the supposed inanimate night statues spring to life and start walking you down. It's a close quarters situation that is sure to keep you on edge, and the same can be said about the courtyard. Needing to find an item, you head out there and you hear the dogs running in between this maze of hedges, hearing their growls until suddenly they jump out at you. This section is one of my personal favorite segments of the game, just because how it keeps you, on edge, encouraging you to play the game a bit more slower compared to the previous action-heavy areas. And finally, the water room. What more can be said about this iconic room that hasn't already been said? Well, just know, it's challenging, throws a lot of enemies at you, and you gotta play wild. There is another enemy in this area and its segment, but it's pretty minor and they're pretty annoying too, but they don't have much more of an impact on the game, so moving on. The castle area is also a part where the story is the most intriguing, mainly because of the character interactions, and of course one of the most iconic parts of Resident Evil 4, the dialogue. We are introduced to 2 characters of note in the castle, Ada Wong and Ramon Salazar. Although we can see Ada in an optional cutscene in the village section by backtracking to a room which shows a cutscene of a certain someone in a red dress luring Chief Mendes out of a window. However, her introduction in the castle is iconic, to say the least. She gets Leon into a one-on-one fight situation before they exchange some quick martial arts, and Leon gets the upper hand, putting her in check. It's a cool cutscene and is bound to leave lots of questions in your mind, like, why is Ada here? How did she survive the events of Raccoon City after supposedly dying? Well, the game poses those questions for you, but Leon doesn't really seem too concerned with them, but is more focused on why she's working for Wesker, before Ada does some Ada spy shenanigans and bounces out of there. I mean, considering that they had a strong relationship of some sort in Resident Evil 2, it's a bit odd that they don't, well, really touch upon it here. They just there and start talking about business as usual. The other main character that we meet in the castle is this guy. We all know him, he's Ramon Salazar. He serves as the main antagonist of this area, like how Chief Mendes was the main antagonist of the village. However, he has strong interactions with Leon and they're more frequent. These two bounce off of each other so well, like they're both trying to one-up each other, and that's what makes their interaction so much fun to watch and witness. There are countless montages of their interactions between one another on the internet, but here are just a few so that you can see what I'm talking about.
Haha, you're nothing but an extra in my script, so don't get too carried away. Your biggest scene is over.
I don't ever remember bit of your crappy script.
So maybe you have 9 lives, but it doesn't matter now, Mr. Kennedy. I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
The interactions between Salazar and Leon aren't the only good ones here, but there are more that rise to comedic status. Take, and I know this sounds wild, but Luis's death scene. It's a really sad moment, the one true insider we could rely on in this village, until Leon just decides to completely mispronounce his name.
Louis!
I'm almost done with the castle area, but I have to touch upon one more thing regarding Salazar, and that is that his boss fight is pretty easy if you use your options correctly. He can be one-shotted with an RPG. Take that as you will, but that's the castle. Strong atmosphere and some pretty good comedic moments. If you want to see me dissect the comedy entirely from Resident Evil 4, here's a link to a video I made about this topic if you want to check it out, or delve into it a bit further. But speaking of writing and such, let's move on and talk about the story of Resident Evil 4. I don't want to spend too long talking about the plot and story of Resident Evil 4, because going over every single story beat or lore detail would make a whole other video on par with the same length as this one. So instead, I've written down some bullet points from my first playthrough of RE4 in regards to the story, dialogue, and characters, and I'm going to try and remember why I wrote those down and relay my thoughts to you. Pros. Number 1. Characters are really well developed. Yes, I still agree with this sentiment. The characters in RE4 are super well developed and have very entertaining and intriguing storylines, from the goofy banter between Leon and Salazar to the mysterious natures of Ada and Luis, to Sadler's evil intentions. The characters all have very satisfying arcs that don't try to go too over the top, but aren't too simplified either. Number 2, the dialogue is so cheesy that it's good. Yeah, 100% agree.
What are you talking about?
Number 3, the story is paced to perfection. This is arguably one of the strongest factors to both RE4's narrative and its gameplay. The game keeps moving on a steady pace, introducing new plot points, resolving them, and constantly keeps the loop going. Unlike many other games that try to drag the good parts on for too long or cut the fun parts too short, RE4 makes everything last for the time that it needs to, not too long or too little, perfectly balanced as all things should. Although I have some complaints about pacing in regards to a certain area of the game, that's again for a later section. But moving on, number 4 connects to the lore of the previous titles. Well, I don't really remember what I was thinking when I wrote that part down, because I can't really think of the big lore points. Yes, Wesker working in the background is a big one, but since I'm not a big lore guy, I just enjoyed the games for what they are, and that's another positive of this game. Even though the game is the 4th one in the series, it's still very standalone and is pretty self-contained, making it a good first Resident Evil game for anyone to start off with, and that's the general pros that I've written down for the story of RE4. Overall, it's very easy to follow, very goofy dialogue in between the more hectic combat situations that strikes a fine balance, so overall, this is what a good but simple video game story should be. Now for the negatives, bit strange, there seems to be only one that I've written down. Number 1. Chopper Mike never got his beer. Rest in peace, Mike. Gone, but far from forgotten. Serenity. This theme is different compared to the more common save theme of the game. Although the more common one is relaxing and tranquil as a save theme should be, it also has this intensity to it, encouraging you to press onwards with your journey. Serenity is much more slower paced, focusing more on its slow building chords, notes that play once in a while. A company that this song is only played in select save rooms and in areas where the merchant shows up, it helps create the feeling of respite, knowing that you can relax here, recollect your thoughts, stock up on new items. It's a safe space in this hectic village. The duality between these two themes for me shows two things. One, that Resident Evil save themes are some of the best pieces of relaxing music out of any game franchise, and two, being that the Capcom sound team went hard in the music room, not just relating to music, but also in its sound design. If you look at the history of the Game Awards hosted by Jeff Keighley, you will realize one thing, and it's that all Resident Evil games since Resident Evil 7, meaning Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil Village, and of course Resident Evil 7, have all been nominated for Best Sound Design over the years. This is arguably one of the strongest factors that binds all Resident Evil games together, and is a part of a long legacy and strive to immerse the players through audio, and RE4 is a part of this. The way the Ganado sound when they strike you, find you, or hear them mumbling off in the far distance all help create this eerie feeling and uneasiness. Weapon sounds also aid in immersing the player through sound, with each shot carrying its weight as the shots fly and as they land on their designated targets. Playing RE4 blind, you will be able to understand the fear and horror that they are managing to create here strictly through sound. And even if the game is a lot more action-packed, I think that it's audio that grounds the player in the horror. And of course, since the audio design plays such a strong role in creating the horror, the music also pulls its weight in helping immersing the player in the world of Resident Evil 4. Although many people always say that the save themes are the best songs from any Resident Evil game, I prefer the more action-focused tracks. Songs like the helicopter attack sequence or the Krauser boss fight, two songs that follow each other up in almost quick succession, setting the stakes really high here and making it clear that failure isn't an option. But my personal favorite piece of music in RE4 are the Ganado themes. These songs that go along with your encounters with the Ganados are so off-putting. They just flat out sound so wrong, and once you hear those faint sounds come in, you know that stuff's about to get real. This is also a reason as to why the introduction to RE4 is so memorable, is that the Ganado theme of the very first Ganado is so offsetting that it sets a mark for your later encounters with these evil residents. The Capcom sound team simply doesn't miss. However, one element that is a bit of a hit or miss with some players is the final area of the game, the island. Even if there are an equal amount of people that love the village and castle, you have to cut that down in half and then some to find the amount of people that have the island as their favorite area of the game. For me personally, I do find the island to be the weakest point of the game, but that doesn't mean that I don't dislike the area, because some of my favorite parts of Resident Evil 4 are in the island. So, let's start off with the weaker elements of the island first, and the first one also links well with my second negative of the island. The pacing of the island is poor due to a significant increase in action. I said it, and I will stand by it. Although RE4 is very much an action horror game, this game creates its balance of horror and action by making you feel overwhelmed with the many enemies, and Leon's initial weakness combined with the uncertainty about what the Ganados are capable of makes you think about making every shot count and trying to conserve your healing items. The island kinda just throws it all out of the window. The moment you enter the island, you will realize that the Ganados here are a lot more tankier, and one of them has a minigun. Leon has also evolved from his initial start in the game, now probably boasting a hefty catalog of items and weapons and a bigger HP bar thanks to the health upgrades. From a game design perspective, the game is telling you to go guns blazing. Use everything you have, take them all out, fight fire with fire, and so forth. Shoot, eliminate, move on, repeat. That is essentially the main gameplay cycle of the island, and it's a massive departure from the previous areas of the game, where combat was more about making your shots count compared to just shooting everything on sight. And because of this significant rise in action, the pacing of the game takes a massive hit as well. Personally, when the action started ramping up, I lost interest and tried to get through these sections as fast as possible because it just didn't jive with me. It's kind of like if in a Metroid game where instead of having these moments of exploration and discovery before combat encounters, you just make every situation a combat encounter. The game can become a bit tiring for some. There is one action sequence, the one with the Chopper Mike section, where the rescue helicopter comes in and helps you with taking out some of the Ganados, but it was entertaining for the fact that Chopper Mike is an underrated character and managed to leave an impact with his short appearance in game. However, there is one action sequence on the island that I enjoyed a lot, and those were the encounters with Jack Krauser, the other American. Throughout the game, you are given subtle hints that there is another American within the game. Krauser is a stellar character, not only for his design and lore purposes, but his fights are amazing. The Krauser quick time event knife fight, amazing. But his actual boss fight, even better. Trying to run around in a deserted area before being led up to a tower where you fight one-on-one to the death whilst a timer ticks down leads to a very memorable scenario. It's fun to use every single weapon in your arsenal to try and take him out, but the best detail to his fight is that Krauser is weak to knife attacks, so you can run up to him, knife him, deal more damage, and end the fight quicker than expected. Nice touch of detail linking back to the QTE knife fight. And since we are on the topic of bosses, we must talk about my favorite boss in the entire game, U3. This thing is totally Resident Evil. He looks like a failed experiment, so pretty scary looking, and his boss fight has a pretty scary gimmick around him too. You're on this container carrier thing, and you have to try and escape him in tight corridors, finding the right buttons in a set amount of time to move on to the next container and send the other one flying down into the abyss. I love this boss because it creates this fear and perfect tension. Running around frantically, shooting the buttons, shooting U3 to ward it off. Perfect horror right here. And once you have dislocated all the containers and send it to its supposed death, it comes back and it becomes a regular boss fight, but it's the container sequence that makes this fight so memorable for me. And U3 is one element of a factor that the island does well, and that is creating really scary horror encounters. Sure, the Garrador enemies are quite unpredictable in their attack patterns, making them scary, but the regenerators, these are just straight up creepy. I think the Resident Evil franchise always has this one enemy that is so scary that in that moment when it's introduced, the game decides to be the scariest game of all time, but only just for a moment. The baby in Resident Evil Village, or the Crimson Heads in Resident Evil 1 Remake, and now the Regenerators. These fellas are beyond creepy. The music, their breathing that sounds desperate and so off-putting, with their deathly bland looks, and the main fact, you don't know how to kill them at first. They can only be killed by shooting the specific parasite located in their body, which can only be seen through a thermal scope, which does get introduced shortly after your first Regenerator encounter. And of course, if you manage to only injure them, they can regenerate as the name implies, or just jump at you with their limited movement capabilities. Hands down, when RE4 wants to be a pure horror game, it does it right. And that's why I love the horror sections of the island, and I only wish that there were more of them. Now for my final complaint as we get closer to the end game, is the final boss, Saddler. Although a very intriguing villain, has a very lackluster boss fight. He simply just mutates himself into this spider thing, and then it's just shoot and run. Simple as that. The reason as to why I find this boss so lacking is the fact that the other bosses on the island, U3 and Krauser, were so good and set a super high bars. Yes, these two might have set the bar extremely high, making it hard for Saddler to rival them. The music isn't doing it for me, and there isn't really anything special to make Saddler stand out. So when I did beat him, I felt very whelmed, but the game quickly turned things around with the jet ski section. This escape sequence was good fun, although I did die a fair too many times that I want to admit. It was a nice way to end the game. And then, when the island goes boom, Leon and Ashley look back at the island, where Ashley poses this very important question.
After you take me back to my place, how about we do some, overtime?
Sorry.
And into the horizon they go, onto the next adventure that awaits them, and roll credits. And really, even if the game ends with a happy ending, the end credits paint a sadder picture. The credits show a slideshow of photos of the past lives of the villagers before they all got infected with the parasites, working hard, living life until suddenly, life isn't the same anymore. They get infected and the parasites take control over them. This is probably the saddest moment in the game, as you might not have thought much about their previous lives, but here it is in a showcase after you had to take them out and put them out of their misery. No thoughts, no freedom, no life. There are still lots of stuff that I haven't mentioned or talked about enough from RE4, like how iconic the merchant is, more in-depth look at all the weapons, the quick time events, or even the separate ways, or the mercenary mode, or the timeless art direction of the game. There are so many things that this game did right by influencing future games with its camera system, quick time events, and so much more. Truth be told, there's just so much to talk about from Resident Evil 4, and don't at me for this, but I simply forgot to go in depth on these topics that I mentioned while writing. However, I did think that I managed to touch upon most of what makes RE4 great, because there is a lot of it, and with the remake coming out in like 3 weeks, I think it would be a good time to look ahead to what the remake can do to make it stand out from the original. I'm beyond excited for this game, hands down. As of right now, my most anticipated games are The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Final Fantasy XVI, Metroid Prime 4, PS, Nintendo, please give us some info this year, thanks, and of course, Resident Evil 4 Remake. The trailers they've shown for the game are insane, and as of writing this on the 18th of February, the marketing for the game has been kind of light, and I can understand why the marketing so far has been relaxed. Everyone knows how good RE4 is, and if the remake turns out to be as good or even better than the original, it will spread simply by word of mouth. The Game Informer coverage has shown some pretty neat details like how Ashley functions, the darker tone of the church era, and the revamped combat, and the art direction of the game just looks super good too. Of course, I mentioned in my remake video from almost 2 weeks back, how can remakes coexist with the originals? Well, just based from the looks of RE4 Remake, you know this game is going to play out far more different than the original. By going in this more horror-focused approach, it seems to still make the original game still worth revisiting. Combine this with the fact that the story will differ in this retelling, these two games can stand side by side. Ashley will be more likable according to the devs as well, so that's also pro for those who weren't a fan of her in the original. I mean, we still don't know much about RE4 Remake, but if we look at all the footage that has been shown thus far, and looking at the team that's behind this remake, I can confidently say that Resident Evil 4 Remake will be one amazing remake, and overall, a great game, or even better, an amazing game. Resident Evil 4 is regarded as one of the best games of all time, and I hope that this video managed to explain why that is the case. From its very first moments until the credits roll, Resident Evil 4 is a roller coaster with some super high highs and some highs. In my opinion, the game doesn't dip into the bad quality at all, with its biggest flaw being the pacing and action segments of the game, but those are subjective and every person has a different experience with it. But from its weaponry to its sound design, iconic locations, memorable dialogue, soothing music, fun gameplay loop, great bosses, and so much more, it's certain that Resident Evil 4 doesn't just carry the right characteristics to be called one of the all-time greats, but it's also the game changer. And with that, welcome to the end of the video. Man, this was a long one, not only to record but also to write. It's time consuming writing videos this long, but it's so much fun to do so, especially if the topics is fun and interesting to talk about like Resident Evil 4, but what are you guys' thoughts on Resident Evil 4? What makes this game the game it is, in your opinion? What do you hope to see change in the remake? Leave your takes down below, and as always, any support or critiques are appreciated down below in the comments with a like or a sub even if you enjoyed this video. Right then, that's it. I finished possibly the 3 most ambitious videos in these last 2.5 weeks, and they were so much fun to work on. I'm probably going to take the rest of the month a bit lighter, focus on some other stuff in my personal life, and I may or may not upload another video by the end of the month, but who knows, we'll just see what time has in store or whatever happens. But for now, I'm going to go back to play some Super Metroid, so I'm heading out. Again, thanks so much for watching this video all the way to the end, and I hope that you enjoyed this video despite its long length. I don't have much else to say other than I hope you have a good day or night and the rest of your week, and I hope to see you in the next one. So with that, Storm out.